This is a homily for the 29th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 53, verses 10 and 11. The second reading is from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 10, verses 35 to 45. Once again, we are with Jesus and the disciples as they journey from Galilee to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover, one of the three great pilgrimage festivals in Judaism. Just 3 verses before the passage chosen for today's Gospel, the evangelist Mark tells us that Jesus and the disciples were on the road going up to Jerusalem. On the road is a translation of the Greek ente hodo. As I've pointed out a number of times already, the Greek word hodos can be translated as road, but more often than not in Mark's Gospel it refers to the way of discipleship. Notice also that Mark tells us that they are going up to Jerusalem. When travelling from north to south, in this case from Galilee to Jerusalem, we'd normally use the expression going down. Jews, however, always spoke about going up to Jerusalem. As you can see, Capernaum is about 208 metres below sea level, and Jerusalem is about 780 metres above sea level. So Jesus and the disciples are quite literally going up to Jerusalem. Over a distance of about 137 kilometres, they will have ascended almost 1 kilometre by the time that they reach Jerusalem. Pope Benedict makes this observation. To begin with, it is an ascent in a geographical sense. The ultimate goal of Jesus' ascent is his self-offering on the cross. This ascent into God's presence leads via the cross. This brings us to the 3 prophecies of the Passion that we have in chapters 8, 9 and 10. In other words, Jesus tells the disciples 3 times what fate awaits him in Jerusalem. The first of the 3 prophecies of the Passion is in chapter 8. Jesus says, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." In the following chapter we have the second prophecy of the Passion. The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. Finally, in chapter 10, we have the third prophecy of the Passion. "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise again." So how do the disciples react to these 3 prophecies? After the first prophecy, as we heard several weeks ago, Peter rebukes Jesus. After the second prophecy, Mark tells us that the disciples did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. A little later, when they reach Capernaum, Jesus asks them what they were arguing about on the way. They were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about which of them is the greatest. Today's Gospel is the reaction to the third prophecy of the Passion. James and John come to Jesus seeking positions of honour. We'll come back to this in a moment. Following each of the three prophecies, the disciples are bewildered. They are wondering what on earth Jesus is talking about. It's inconceivable that the Messiah would be condemned to death as a common criminal. You can understand why Mark frames the journey to Jerusalem between two miracles in which Jesus heals a blind man. It's his commentary on the failure of the disciples to see. And this failure becomes evident in their inappropriate responses to each of the three prophecies. However, in fairness to the disciples, the idea of a suffering Messiah would have been totally unthinkable within Judaism. New Testament scholar Tom Wright tells us that the very mention of crucifixion was taboo in polite Roman circles, since it was the lowest form of capital punishment, reserved for slaves and rebels. As for the Jews, the very idea of a crucified Messiah was scandalous. A crucified Messiah was a horrible parody of the kingdom dreams that many were cherishing. It immediately implied that Israel's national hope was being radically redrawn downward. New Testament scholar Joel Marcus argues that the reaction of the disciples is quite realistic. One idea that does not seem to be prominent in pre-Christian Judaism is that of the suffering Messiah. No early Jewish text speaks of such a figure. To Christians, the idea of a suffering Messiah seems natural, but that is because it is so deeply rooted in a Christian understanding of the Old Testament. In Judaism, however, the Davidic Messiah is associated with triumph, not defeat and death. Tom Wright describes the idea of a suffering Messiah in these words: "You might as well expect a footballer planning the biggest game of the season to explain to his friends that he was going to play with his legs tied together." Probably not all Jews of the time believed that God would send a Messiah. But nobody at all believed that if and when God did send one, that Messiah would have to suffer, still less have to die. Let's now turn to today's Gospel. Jesus has just told the disciples what fate awaits him in Jerusalem. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come forward with an extraordinary request that is breathtaking in its audacity. "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Their request is the equivalent of asking Jesus for a blank cheque. Their self-centredness shows how they, like Peter and the other disciples, have failed to grasp the meaning of what Jesus has just said. Jesus asks the brothers what they want, and they tell him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." Jesus doesn't brush aside their request. Rather, he confronts them with the implications of their request. He does this by asking the brothers, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" The word baptism, as it's used here, does not refer to the sacrament of baptism. The Greek verb from which we get our English word baptism means literally to plunge or immerse. So Jesus is asking the brothers, "Can you be plunged into the fate that awaits me?" Without batting an eyelid, they reply, "We can." But they're obviously not thinking of being plunged into suffering and death. We could say that the disciples are on a quest, and Jesus is teaching them the way. But what is their quest? What do they seek? Right now they're thinking of power and victory, about positions of honour and prestige. And the other disciples are no better. They're indignant at the attempted power grab by James and John. I spoke about the quest last Sunday. Christopher Booker includes the quest as one of the 7 basic plots in storytelling. He writes, "No type of story is more instantly recognisable to us than a quest. Far away, we learn, there is some priceless goal worth any effort to achieve, a treasure, a promised land, something of infinite value." The great medieval philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas also reflected on the human quest, our ultimate goal. What do we seek? To name the goal of our quest, he used the Latin word beatitudo. Sometimes beatitudo is translated as happiness, but I don't think that happiness is an adequate translation, and for this reason. The root of our English word happiness is the Old Norse and Old English word hap, which means chance or luck. Think of some of the words that include hap. It just happened. In other words, it wasn't planned. Or the word haphazard. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Or the word perhaps. Maybe yes, maybe no, who can tell? So the underlying meaning of happiness is something dependent upon chance, luck, or good fortune. If, for example, you're going on a picnic and it's a warm and sunny day, you'd be happy. If the weather is cold, wet, and blustery, you'd be unhappy. Happiness, in other words, is as fickle as the weather. Beatitudo could be described as a serene and untouchable joy. And how do you achieve beatitudo? St. Thomas tells us about 4 paths that people take on their quest for beatitudo, but these 4 paths are all dead ends. The first is wealth. But wealth is a dead end because it is really only a means to obtain the things that we really want. When Jesus told the rich man to sell everything he owns and give the money to the poor, his face fell at those words. He was afraid to let go of the very thing that was holding him back from beatitudo. Secondly, honour. The society in which Jesus lived revolved around honour and shame. And they are surely just as important to us today in the 21st century. None of us likes being publicly shamed or humiliated, and I'm sure that none of us would mind being publicly honoured. However, honour and shame, like wealth, are not ends in themselves. Honour and shame are society's way of pointing out what is praiseworthy and important and what is not. Thirdly, power. Power is important, but again, it is ultimately a means to achieve other things that we find important or desirable. Finally, pleasure. Again, pleasure is not really an end in itself. It is a byproduct of doing something that we enjoy doing. In terms of what St. Thomas Aquinas has said, what are the disciples James and John asking for? By seeking positions at Jesus' right and left hand, they are really after positions of honour and therefore of power. So Jesus calls the disciples to him and tells them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those who are known as rulers lord it over them, and their great men tyrannize them. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. Two key words here characterize the Christian vocation: diakonos, which means servant, and doulos, which means slave. For free people in the Greco-Roman world, there were few greater horrors than being a slave. Slavery was utter degradation. New Testament scholar John Mayer offers this reflection. Jesus uses the occasion of his disciples' pettiness to teach his lofty ideal of service. Hellenistic societies knew all too well the arbitrary exercise of authority on the part of their vain and self-centred rulers. But this world cannot supply the model for leadership in the church. Church leadership is modelled on the paradox of the cross, the inversion of all values and ambitions. Jesus does not reject all desire for greatness and leadership in the kingdom, but the path to that goal dips into the valley of service, even slavery. Jesus first speaks of the servant, the person who freely puts himself at the disposition of others, and then radicalizes his statement with the image of the slave, the non-person who has no rights or existence of his own, who exists solely for others. Only this startling denial of self for the sake of others, and not power politics, can effectively win humanity to the gospel. Church leaders who derive their tools and signs of power from this world betray the gospel of Jesus. Today's gospel concludes with these final words of Jesus: "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The word translated here as ransom is lutron. It is the word that is used to describe the price that must be paid to liberate people from some kind of bondage. So it is the price paid to free a slave or a prisoner of war. It's the price paid to release someone who has been kidnapped. This is one of many biblical images of salvation. We are held captive against our will and cannot free ourselves. The word ransom is a powerful metaphor, but it is limited in its scope and cannot be pushed too far. The evangelist Mark isn't interested in questions such as, who is the ransom paid to? Does God have to negotiate with someone else in order to release humanity from bondage? Mark is simply using the metaphor of ransom to tell us that by dying, Jesus sets us free from the power of sin and death. The slavery motif also takes us back to the years when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt and God sent Moses to rescue them. The ministry of Jesus is heralding a new and greater exodus. Today's second reading from the letter to the Hebrews offers us another biblical image of salvation, that of Jesus as high priest. Jesus was not born of Levitical or priestly descent. We know that he belonged to the tribe of Judah, not Levi. So he was a Jewish layman, not a priest. Christians are accustomed to the image of Jesus the priest or the great high priest, and we owe that image to the letter to the Hebrews. There, and there alone within the New Testament, Jesus is called a priest and a high priest. But the author of the letter to the Hebrews does not base his claim that Jesus is a priest on Levitical lineage. The author explains that Jesus obtained a priestly office superior to the Levitical one, namely a priesthood like that of Melchizedek. Jesus becomes a priest by undergoing a sacrificial death on the cross and then entering the heavenly sanctuary. In today's second reading, we have the image of the crucified and risen Lord entering into the highest heaven. Here we have the image of Jesus, the high priest, who can provide access to God in a way that the earthly high priest could not. Jesus makes it possible for us to approach the throne of grace. Notice that the Son of Man has come to give his life as a ransom for many, which is antipolon in the Greek. We have here an echo of the closing lines of the fourth of the servant songs in the prophet Isaiah. This is the first reading for this Sunday. In chapter 53, verse 11, we read, "My servant, the righteous one, will justify many by taking their guilt on himself." The following verse speaks about the servant bearing the sin of many and interceding for the rebellious. The servant suffers vicariously, enduring his agony so that others can be justified. His death will win life for others, and in this way he will accomplish God's will. If the echoes of Isaiah's suffering servant sound somewhat subtle, keep in mind these words of New Testament scholar Richard Hayes. These associations are perceptible only for readers with ears to hear the subtexts of Mark's narrative. It is not Mark's way to make the connections overt. The disciples are on a quest. So let's now have a closer look at this quest by using Christopher Booker's analysis of one of the basic patterns that shapes the way that we tell stories. Stories begin with what Booker calls the anticipation stage. We, as readers or members of an audience, meet the hero, and we soon become aware of the hero's quest. Jesus is obviously the hero of the gospel story, but Booker's analysis describes perfectly the journey of the disciples. We know from John's gospel that Peter, Andrew, and Philip were disciples of John the Baptist, so they were obviously on a quest. When the Baptist points out Jesus to Andrew and another unnamed disciple, they begin to follow Jesus. Towards the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, Jesus calls Peter and Andrew and James and John. But the reader knows absolutely nothing about them apart from the fact that they are fishermen. The dream stage follows the anticipation stage. The adventure begins, and there is some success. There may even be an illusion of invincibility. In Mark's Gospel, this corresponds to Jesus sending out the 12 in pairs. They are successful in casting out demons and healing the sick. Upon their return, they rejoin Jesus and tell him all they had done and taught. The frustration stage follows. Almost imperceptibly, things begin to go wrong, which leads to a sense of frustration. This is the first confrontation with the enemy. In Mark's Gospel, the enemy is the evil one, named variously as Satan, demons, unclean spirits, Beelzebul, and Legion. But this is not the enemy that the disciples encounter here. They are struggling with what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. As we've already seen, Jesus has told the disciples 3 times the fate that awaits him in Jerusalem, and on each occasion they fail to understand what he is saying. Jesus describes discipleship in terms of taking up a cross and following him, of being servant and slave, and of losing one's life. The disciples, however, are thinking in terms of positions of honour, about which of them is the greatest. The idea of a crucified Messiah is totally beyond their comprehension. A cartoon by Michael Leunig offers an interesting insight into what is happening here. He found God. God spoke to him. God said, "Help me, I'm wounded." God lay bleeding on the ground. This is all too much for him to take in. This is not how he imagined God to be. "You're not God. God is all-powerful." God replies, "I am all vulnerable. I am in pain. I am at your mercy." These words were so unbearable to the man, so infuriating, that he finished God off right there and then. That could well be a commentary on what happened in the region of Caesarea Philippi. By Peter's reckoning, the Messiah is going to be a powerful, victorious figure, not someone who is vulnerable, someone who will suffer and die. Peter wants to stop such nonsense. He wants to put an end to this ridiculous idea of a suffering and dying Messiah. But Jesus corrects him in no uncertain terms. That is not God's way of thinking. The lesson that the disciples have yet to learn is this: in the upside-down world of God's kingdom, it's about a cross, not a crown. It's about being last, not first. About being servant and slave, not lord. About service, not prestige. About self-sacrifice, not honour and glory. The disciples haven't yet grasped this truth, but it is the path to beatitudo. This brings us to the nightmare stage. There is a mounting sense of threat as the authorities close in on Jesus and the disciples. Hope is apparently lost. Judas betrays Jesus. Jesus is arrested, and all of the disciples deserted Jesus and fled. Jesus is led off to be interrogated by the high priest, and Peter follows at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. When confronted by a servant girl and other bystanders, Peter denies 3 times even knowing Jesus. He starts cursing and swearing. "I do not know this man you are talking about." We come, finally, to the resolution. At this stage, there is triumph against the odds. In Mark's Gospel, however, the resolution is open-ended, unlike the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. Very early on Sunday morning, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bring spices so that they might go and anoint the body of Jesus. When they reach the tomb, they find that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe. He says to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." This young man, clothed in white, obviously an angel, then tells the women, "Go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Mark then tells us that the women came out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and amazement had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Most scholars agree that Mark ended his Gospel at chapter 16, verse 8. But you'll notice that the New Testament includes some additional verses 9 to 20, which give an overview of various appearances of the risen Lord. However, these additional verses are not in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, and the vocabulary and style differ from the rest of Mark. They were added by someone else at a later date, presumably because it was felt that the Gospel couldn't end so abruptly, with the women in fear and silence. How do we make sense of the Gospel ending with fear, flight, and silence? Keep in mind that the failure of the male disciples has been an enduring motif throughout Mark's Gospel, as we've already seen. Let's look at the ending to Mark's Gospel from the point of view of Mark's audience, those who first heard or read his Gospel. Firstly, the ending is ironic because it turns back upon the audience. The audience is expecting one thing, but it gets another. As the story reaches its climax, the audience must surely expect that the women will do what the angelic messenger instructs them to do. They will tell Peter and the disciples that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee and that they will see him there. But the women are silent. This ironic ending is Mark's way of challenging the reader or hearer of the Gospel. The audience, rather than being silent as the women were, are to proclaim the good news courageously in the face of persecution. It's as though Mark the evangelist suddenly turns to the audience and addresses them directly. You may have thought that this story was about someone else, but now you've got a decision to make. What are you going to do about it? Finally, and more importantly, the resolution to the gospel story occurs not because of what the disciples do, it is the initiative of God. New Testament scholar Francis Maloney explains, God has raised Jesus from the dead. The Father has not abandoned the Son. The same God will also raise the disciples, men and women, from their failure. They will see the risen Lord in Galilee, but not because the disciples or the women succeed. The event that bridged the gap between the end of the Gospel of Mark and the community which heard it and read it took place because of the initiative of God and not the success of men or women.